At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law leaned close to another guest and whispered that I would probably lose the house within a month. I heard every word, even though she thought I was too distracted with grief to notice. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded politely and continued greeting the people who had come to say goodbye to Robert. What Claire didn't know was that Robert had spent the last decade making sure I would never lose anything again. And she definitely didn't know about the $28 million. The church smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies, the kind of quiet scent that seems to linger in old New England buildings. St. Andrew's had been part of our life for more than 30 years. Robert and I had sat in the same pew nearly every Sunday, usually arriving 10 minutes early because he hated rushing. That morning the pew felt too wide without him, too quiet, too permanent. Guests filled the rows behind me, dressed in dark coats and somber expressions. People spoke softly, the way Americans do at funerals, with gentle handshakes and murmured condolences that blend together after a while. I thanked them all. I smiled when it was appropriate. I kept my voice steady. But every few minutes I noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. Claire greeting guests like she was hosting a charity gala. Daniel standing beside her, nodding politely while she spoke on his behalf. My own son barely looked in my direction. At one point I heard Claire telling a distant cousin, "Margaret won't be able to keep the estate anyway. It's just too much for one person." She said it casually, as if she were discussing the weather. The cousin nodded sympathetically. I kept my eyes forward and folded my hands in my lap. The service began with a quiet hymn Robert loved. The organ echoed through the church, slow and steady. I remembered the first time we heard that hymn together, decades earlier, when we were newly married and still trying to figure out what our life would become. Robert had squeezed my hand that day and whispered that everything would be all right as long as we faced the world together. Now the music played again, but his seat beside me was empty. When the minister began speaking about Robert's life, I listened carefully. He spoke about Robert's kindness, his business success, his loyalty to family. The word family hung in the air longer than the others. Behind me, I heard Claire's voice again, softer this time, but still clear enough. "Daniel will take care of everything soon," she said. "Margaret won't have to worry about the house much longer." I closed my eyes briefly. They thought I was fragile. They thought grief had made me helpless. They thought Robert had left me with nothing but memories and a large old house I couldn't maintain. They were already planning what would happen next. Selling the property, rearranging the future, quietly moving me out of the center of the life Robert and I had built together. I sat through the entire service without saying a word about it. When people came forward to offer their condolences, I thanked them sincerely. When Claire hugged me for the benefit of the crowd, I hugged her back just as warmly. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was simply waiting. Because while everyone else in that church believed I had lost everything that day, I knew something they didn't. Robert Whitmore had never left me powerless. And at my husband's funeral, while my family quietly discussed what would happen to the estate, I never once mentioned the $28 million. After the service ended, the church slowly emptied the way winter air drifts out of an open doorway, quietly and without announcement. People gathered their coats, exchanged soft goodbyes, and stepped out into the gray Connecticut afternoon where the wind carried the faint smell of snow. I remained seated for a moment longer than everyone else. Robert always liked to leave last. He said it gave him time to thank people properly. I could almost hear his voice reminding me of that as I stood and walked down the aisle toward the doors. Outside, the black cars waited along the curb in a neat line. The funeral director spoke gently to guests as they made their way toward the reception that Claire had arranged at a nearby country club. Claire stood near the steps greeting people again, her posture straight, her voice calm and composed. She looked less like a grieving daughter-in-law and more like someone hosting an afternoon event. Daniel stood beside her, hands in the pockets of his dark overcoat, nodding whenever someone offered condolences. When I approached them, Claire placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. Her smile was warm enough for the people watching. "Margaret, the cars are ready when you are," she said. "We thought the reception would be easier for everyone than staying here in the cold." I thanked her quietly and stepped toward the waiting car. The ride to the country club took about 15 minutes. I watched the familiar streets pass by the window, the same streets Robert and I had driven through thousands of times over the years. Grocery stores, quiet neighborhoods, the small hardware shop he liked on Main Street. Everything looked exactly the same, which felt strange considering how quickly people believed my life had suddenly changed. The Whitmore estate sat only 10 minutes in the opposite direction from the country club. I wondered if anyone else in the car was thinking about that house. The long gravel driveway, the oak trees Robert planted himself, the porch where we drank coffee every morning for nearly 2 decades. I suspected Claire was already imagining it empty. When we arrived, the reception hall was bright and warm. Tables had been arranged with coffee, tea, and small plates of food. Guests stood in small circles speaking quietly. The sound of conversation filled the room in a gentle hum that reminded me of a library on a busy afternoon. I thanked people again as they approached me. Many of them had known Robert for years. They spoke about his patience, his honesty, the way he always remembered birthdays and anniversaries. Listening to them felt like hearing pieces of a life that had been carefully built one day at a time. Across the room, I noticed Claire speaking with a real estate agent I recognized from town. They stood near the window where the winter light made their silhouettes sharp against the glass. Daniel joined them a moment later. I could not hear everything they said, but I caught enough to understand the direction of the conversation. "The property is beautiful," the agent said. "It will not stay on the market long." Claire nodded slowly. "That is exactly what we thought. Margaret will probably want something smaller soon anyway. A place that is easier to manage." Daniel gave a quiet laugh that sounded almost uncomfortable. "Yes, something simpler might be better for her." I stirred my coffee with a small silver spoon and watched the steam rise from the cup. No one at their table looked toward me. They believed I was standing alone, distracted, fragile, and unaware of what was being decided around me. In their minds, the future of the Whitmore estate had already begun to shift direction. They simply did not realize that every document connected to that house had been carefully prepared long before today. Robert had always been a patient man, and sometimes patience has a way of revealing itself at exactly the right moment. The reception slowly thinned as the afternoon light faded behind the tall windows of the country club. People finished their coffee, gathered their coats, and offered the last quiet condolences before leaving. By 4 o'clock the room had grown noticeably quieter. Only a few distant relatives remained, speaking softly near the fireplace. I stood near the window looking out at the parking lot where the winter sky had turned a pale silver. Claire moved through the room collecting small conversations like a careful host. Every few minutes she glanced toward me with the same polite smile she had worn all afternoon. It was a smile designed for witnesses. Daniel finally approached me carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me as if we were sharing a normal conversation on an ordinary day. "Mom, you holding up all right?" he asked. I nodded and thanked him. The coffee was still warm. "Your father would have appreciated how many people came today," I said quietly. Daniel looked down into his cup before answering. "Yes, he was respected." There was a pause between us that felt longer than it actually was. I noticed Daniel glance across the room toward Claire. She was speaking again with the same real estate agent, their heads close together as they reviewed something on a phone screen. Daniel cleared his throat slightly. "Claire and I were talking earlier," he said carefully, "about the house." I stirred the coffee slowly, even though it did not need stirring. "The house has a lot of memories," I replied. Daniel shifted his weight and nodded. "That is true, but it is also a very large property. Nearly 6,000 square feet, plus the land. It might be difficult for one person to manage." His voice carried the gentle tone people use when they believe they are offering practical advice. "There are some beautiful senior communities nearby," he continued. "Places with maintenance included, security, activities. It could make things easier for you." I watched the steam from my coffee fade into the air. For a moment, I thought about the Whitmore estate exactly as it stood. The wide staircase Robert insisted on designing himself. The library with floor-to-ceiling shelves. The long kitchen island where our family had celebrated birthdays and holidays for decades. I remembered Robert sitting at the dining table late one evening several years ago with a stack of papers spread neatly in front of him. He had looked up at me with the same calm expression he always wore when making important decisions. "Margaret," he said gently, "if anything ever happens to me, there is someone you should speak to before making any decisions about the house or the company." I had laughed at the time and told him he was being dramatic. Robert had simply smiled and slid a small card across the table. The name printed on the card read Thomas Keller. I returned my attention to Daniel, who was still waiting for an answer. "That is thoughtful of you to consider," I said. Daniel seemed relieved. He nodded again and took a sip of his coffee. Across the room, Claire looked toward us and offered a satisfied smile before returning to her conversation. They believed the future had already been arranged. What they did not realize was that Robert had never been a man who left important things unfinished. I left the country club just before sunset. The air outside had turned colder, the kind of quiet winter chill that settles over small Connecticut towns once the day begins to fade. The driver asked if I wanted to go home, and for a moment the word home felt heavier than usual. I nodded anyway. The drive to the Whitmore estate took a little under 10 minutes. The road curved through the same familiar neighborhoods Robert and I had driven for decades, past stone walls and old maple trees that were now bare against the pale sky. When the car finally turned onto our gravel driveway, the headlights swept across the long front lawn and the tall oak trees Robert planted nearly 20 years ago. He had insisted on planting them himself, even though the landscaper offered to do it. Robert said some things were worth doing with your own hands if you expected them to last. The house stood quietly at the end of the drive, 3 stories of white siding and dark shutters glowing softly in the porch lights. Nearly 6,000 square feet of space, built slowly over the years as Robert's company grew. To most people it probably looked like a large, comfortable New England estate. To me it looked like 40 years of mornings, dinners, birthdays, and quiet conversations. When I stepped inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness it always had after a long day. The hardwood floors carried the faint scent of polish, and the tall windows reflected the last dim light from outside. I hung my coat in the hallway and walked slowly through the rooms, touching the back of a chair here, the edge of a table there, as if confirming that everything was still exactly where it belonged. The kitchen light remained on over the island where Robert used to sit reading the newspaper every morning. I poured a glass of water and sat down at the same chair he preferred. The quiet gave my mind space to return to a memory I had nearly forgotten earlier that afternoon. It was a late autumn evening several years ago when Robert had called me into his study. He rarely used that room for anything except paperwork and long phone calls with investors. That night the desk was covered in neatly arranged folders and a small stack of documents. Robert looked calm, almost amused, the way he often did when planning something carefully. "Margaret," he said, sliding a business card across the desk toward me. "If there ever comes a time when people begin making decisions about our home without asking you first, promise me you will speak to this man." I picked up the card and read the name printed in clean black letters. Thomas Keller, attorney at law. I had asked Robert why he sounded so serious about something that might never happen. Robert simply smiled the way he did whenever he already knew the answer to a question I had not fully asked. "Because sometimes," he said gently, "people behave very differently when they believe the future belongs to them." Sitting alone in the kitchen now, I reached into my purse and felt the smooth edge of that same card still resting in the inner pocket where I had kept it all these years. Claire and Daniel believed the next chapter of this house had already been decided. They believed the conversations they whispered at the country club had quietly shaped what would happen next. What they did not understand was that Robert had spent decades building more than just a company and a home. He had also built a plan. I slept very little that night. The house remained quiet in the way large houses often do, with faint sounds that only appear after midnight. The soft ticking of the clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional whisper of wind brushing against the tall windows. Robert used to say a house breathes differently after dark. I never noticed it much before. That night I noticed every small sound. Around 6:30 the next morning, the first light of winter filtered through the kitchen windows. I made coffee the same way Robert always did, measuring the grounds carefully even though there was no one left to correct me if I guessed wrong. The warmth of the mug in my hands steadied my thoughts. I placed Robert's old leather notebook on the kitchen table beside the cup. Inside the front cover, he had written several names over the years. Investors, advisors, accountants. But only one name had been underlined twice. Thomas Keller. I looked at the small card again, turning it slowly between my fingers. The address printed beneath his name was in Hartford, about 45 miles away. In good traffic the drive would take a little under an hour. Robert had always spoken about Keller with a quiet respect that he rarely showed for anyone outside the family. That alone had been enough reason for me to keep the card all these years. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, and walked into the hallway where Robert's coat still hung beside mine. For a moment, I rested my hand on the sleeve. Then I picked up my purse and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The gravel driveway crunched under my shoes as I walked to the car. Frost covered the edges of the lawn, turning the grass silver under the pale sun. The drive toward Hartford followed the same highway Robert had taken, countless times for business meetings. Traffic moved steadily, and the quiet rhythm of the road gave my mind space to remember small details from the past few years. Robert had begun organizing documents more carefully than usual. He had taken several long calls behind the closed door of his study. Once or twice I had asked him if everything was all right. He always answered with the same calm reassurance. Everything is exactly as it should be. At the time I believed he meant the company. Now I suspected he had meant something else entirely. When I reached Hartford, the office building stood on a quiet street lined with brick storefronts and tall glass windows. The brass sign beside the entrance listed several professional offices. Keller and Associates occupied the fourth floor. The receptionist greeted me politely when I stepped inside. Her desk was neat, and the waiting room smelled faintly of fresh paper and coffee. I gave her my name and mentioned that Robert Whitmore had once suggested I contact Mr. Keller if I ever needed guidance. The receptionist looked at her computer screen for a moment, then raised her eyebrows slightly, as if recognizing something important. She stood and walked toward a hallway behind the desk. A minute later she returned with a man in his early 60s wearing a dark suit and thin silver glasses. He studied my face carefully before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, extending his hand. "I have been expecting you for quite some time." Thomas Keller's office overlooked a quiet Hartford street where the morning traffic moved slowly between brick buildings and small cafes. He closed the door behind us with a calm, deliberate motion, then gestured toward a chair across from his desk. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of office that had handled serious decisions for many years. I sat down and placed my purse beside the chair. Keller remained standing for a moment, studying me carefully in the way lawyers often observe before they speak. "Robert prepared several things long before today," he said at last. His voice was steady, almost gentle. He believed there might come a time when you would need clarity. He opened a drawer and removed a thick folder bound neatly with a simple black clip. The folder looked as if it had been waiting there untouched for a long time. Keller placed it on the desk and slid it toward me. The first page carried Robert's signature at the bottom in the same confident handwriting I had seen on countless letters and documents over the years. I felt a quiet shift in my chest as I looked at it. Keller folded his hands together and spoke carefully, choosing his words the way someone does when explaining something important but not surprising. "Several years ago, Robert established a legal structure called the Whitmore Legacy Trust," he said. "He asked me to finalize it quietly and to hold the documentation until you decided to come here." I looked up from the papers. "What does the trust include?" Keller adjusted his glasses slightly before answering. "The Whitmore estate property, the primary investment accounts, and the majority share of Robert's company holdings." He paused briefly, giving the information space to settle. "In total, the assets currently under the trust are valued at approximately $28 million. The number did not arrive like a shock. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a conversation Robert had started years earlier. Keller continued speaking in the same measured tone. "You are listed as the sole beneficiary and primary decision-maker. No sale of the estate, no transfer of the company's shares, and no access to the trust funds can occur without your direct authorization." I thought back to the reception hall the day before. Claire standing near the window with the real estate agent. Daniel explaining gently that the house might be too large for me to manage alone. They had spoken with such quiet certainty. Keller turned another page inside the folder and tapped a paragraph near the center. Robert also included a provision that prevents any secondary family member from altering these arrangements unless you personally request it. I leaned back slightly in the chair, absorbing the calm order of the documents in front of me. The plan had been prepared with the same patience Robert used when building his business. Careful steps, no unnecessary attention. Keller closed the folder slowly and rested his hands on top of it. "Your husband anticipated that people might make assumptions about the future," he said. "He wanted to make sure those assumptions never carried legal weight. Through the tall window behind Keller's desk, I could see the winter sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings across the street. The world outside continued moving in its usual rhythm. Cars passed. People walked along the sidewalks. Nothing about that ordinary morning suggested that the direction of an entire family's plans had just quietly changed. I picked up the folder and held it for a moment before placing it carefully back on the desk. Robert had not raised his voice at the reception hall. He had not corrected Claire's quiet confidence or Daniel's careful suggestions. Instead, he had done something far more effective years earlier. He had written the future down on paper and left it waiting for the moment when I chose to read it. When I left Keller's office, the winter sun had climbed higher over Hartford, reflecting softly against the glass buildings along the street. The folder containing Robert's documents rested quietly inside my purse. It was heavier than the purse itself, not because of the paper, but because of what those pages represented. For years, Robert had quietly built something far more solid than the house on our property or the company he ran with such discipline. He had built protection. The drive back toward our town felt calmer than the drive earlier that morning. Traffic moved steadily along the highway, and the steady rhythm of the road gave me time to think about the conversations from the day before. Claire standing confidently near the reception window. Daniel explaining gently that the house might be too much for me to manage. They had spoken carefully, politely, almost sympathetically. But beneath those polite tones had been something else entirely. Assumption. By the time I reached the Whitmore estate, the afternoon sun had begun to settle behind the tall oak trees lining the driveway. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, quiet and patient at the end of the long gravel path. Inside, the familiar stillness welcomed me again. I placed the folder on the kitchen table and removed my coat. The house carried the same scent of polished wood and fresh coffee from earlier that day. For a moment, I stood by the window looking out at the long lawn where Robert used to walk every evening before dinner. He always said those walks helped him clear his mind before making important decisions. I began to understand why. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly. His voice sounded slightly rushed, the way it does when someone has been thinking about something all afternoon. Mom, Claire and I were discussing the property again, he said. We spoke with a realtor this morning about potential interest in the estate. I remained silent long enough for him to continue. There are buyers who might move quickly, he added. The market is strong right now, and we think it would be best to start planning sooner rather than later. I walked slowly toward the kitchen table where the folder rested. That sounds like a very active conversation, I said quietly. Daniel paused for a moment, perhaps expecting a stronger reaction. When none came, he continued explaining details about potential buyers, renovation costs, and how a smaller residence might simplify my life. His tone remained calm, almost reassuring. When he finished speaking, I thanked him for keeping me informed. Daniel seemed relieved by the lack of resistance. Claire and I will handle the next steps, he said. We will make sure everything is arranged properly. After we ended the call, I looked down at the folder on the table. Inside were the documents that determined exactly who could arrange what. Robert had not built his company by reacting quickly to every conversation around him. He had always believed that the most effective decisions were made quietly, after everyone else believed the outcome had already been settled. Outside the window, the winter sunlight faded slowly across the lawn. Somewhere in town, Claire and Daniel were likely continuing their careful plans about the future of the estate. What they did not yet understand was that every plan they were making had already stepped into a structure Robert designed years ago. And that structure belonged entirely to me. I spent the next morning exactly the way Robert used to start difficult days, slowly and without announcing any decision too early. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that allows thoughts to move clearly. Winter light filtered through the tall kitchen windows, stretching across the wooden floor and the long island where Robert once reviewed contracts before leaving for the office. I made coffee the same way he always insisted it should be made, measuring the grounds carefully and letting the machine finish its slow work. Outside, the lawn was pale under a thin layer of frost, and the oak trees stood still in the cold air. Everything looked calm, almost ordinary, which made the conversations from the day before feel even more distant. Around mid-morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Claire. Her voice carried the same polite tone she used whenever other people were listening. but there was a sharper edge beneath it. "Margaret," she said, "Daniel and I spoke with the realtor again this morning. A few buyers are already interested in seeing the property." I listened quietly as she continued explaining the situation with confident efficiency. She spoke about the market conditions, about how quickly large estates could sell in the area, and how it would be wise to move forward before interest rates changed. When she paused, I thanked her for keeping me informed. Claire sounded pleased by my calm response. "We thought it might be helpful if Daniel and I stopped by the house this afternoon," she added, "just to review a few things and talk about next steps." I agreed without hesitation. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the kitchen table beside the folder Keller had given me the day before. The documents rested there quietly, the same way they had rested for years in Keller's office, waiting for the moment they would matter. Robert had always believed timing was the most important part of any decision. I spent the next hour walking through the house. The study still held Robert's desk exactly as he left it. The living room carried the soft scent of the fireplace we used during winter evenings. In the dining room, the long table stood polished and ready as if another holiday dinner might happen at any moment. Each room held the same quiet memories of the life we built slowly together. By early afternoon, a car turned into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Daniel step out first, followed by Claire carrying a leather folder of her own. They walked toward the front door with the steady confidence of people who believed they were arriving to finalize something that had already been decided. When I opened the door, Claire greeted me with a warm smile and stepped inside. Daniel followed a moment later, glancing around the entry hall with the thoughtful expression of someone imagining changes. "It is such a beautiful house," Claire said as she removed her coat. "But large. Places like this can become overwhelming." Daniel nodded gently beside her. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly for you." I led them into the kitchen where the afternoon light stretched across the table. Claire opened her folder and began arranging several documents neatly in front of her. Property estimates, realtor information, preliminary listings. They spoke about timelines and potential buyers with the calm certainty of people who believed they were guiding the conversation toward a simple conclusion. I listened patiently as they explained their plans. When Claire finished outlining the next steps, she looked at me with the same reassuring smile she had worn at the reception. "All we would need," she said, sliding one paper forward, "is your approval to begin the process." I rested my hands lightly on the kitchen table. The folder Keller gave me sat quietly beside my purse, exactly where I had placed it earlier. Claire and Daniel waited with patient confidence, certain that the future of the Whitmore estate was now a practical matter of signatures and timing. What they still did not realize was that Robert had already written the real decision years before this conversation ever began. Claire's pen rested neatly beside the document she had placed in front of me. The kitchen remained quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the wooden table, touching the edge of the paper she expected me to sign. Daniel stood beside the counter with his arms folded loosely, watching my reaction with careful patience. They both carried the same calm confidence people often have when they believe a conversation has already reached its final step. I looked down at the paper Claire had prepared. It was a simple authorization form allowing a realtor to begin listing the Whitmore estate. Property photographs, marketing plans, open house schedules. Everything had been arranged with impressive efficiency. Claire spoke again, her voice soft and reassuring. "It is only the first step," she said. "Once the listing goes live, we can take our time choosing the right offer." Daniel nodded beside her. "We just want to make things easier for you." I folded my hands calmly on the table and looked at both of them for a moment. They were not speaking cruelly. In their minds, they were being practical, even helpful. That was what made the moment strangely quiet rather than confrontational. Finally, I reached into my purse and removed the folder Thomas Keller had given me the day before. I placed it gently on the table beside Claire's document. Claire glanced at it briefly but did not seem concerned. She assumed it was another set of papers related to the estate. "Before we move forward," I said calmly, "there is something your father wanted me to review." I opened the folder and turned it so that the first page faced them. The heading read Whitmore Legacy Trust in clear, formal lettering. Daniel leaned slightly closer to read the page. Claire's confident smile began to fade as she noticed Robert's signature at the bottom. I slid the next document forward. Keller's office seal sat neatly in the corner beside several paragraphs of legal language describing the trust structure Robert had established years earlier. The room remained silent while they read. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice uncertain. "Mom, what exactly is this?" I answered in the same calm tone I had used all afternoon. "It is the plan your father prepared for the estate." Claire scanned the document again, her eyes moving faster across the lines. I could see the moment she reached the section describing ownership and control of the trust. Her posture shifted slightly in the chair. Daniel looked back at me with quiet confusion. I explained slowly, the way Keller had explained it to me. The estate property, the company shares, and the investment accounts had all been placed under the Whitmore Legacy Trust several years earlier. The total value of the assets was currently estimated at $28 million. The documents also stated clearly that the sole beneficiary and decision-maker for the trust was me. No sale of the property, no transfer of ownership, and no financial access could occur without my authorization. Claire closed the folder slowly and sat back in her chair. The confidence she carried when she entered the house had quietly disappeared. Daniel looked between the papers and my face as if trying to understand when the conversation had changed direction. I rested my hands calmly on the table. The kitchen clock continued its steady ticking, the same quiet sound that had filled the room earlier that morning. For a moment no one spoke. Then I looked at them gently and said the only sentence that truly needed to be said. They had treated me as if I had nothing left after Robert's funeral. I simply never mentioned the $28 million.